Hi everyone, I am Vinod. I'm a senior mentor at Skill House. As you are aware, you have gone through my previous videos where I've explained Git operations at high level. Also, I created a detailed video. This time I'm going to explain the operations, each and every step of creating a repository and cloning that repository, committing a change, and pushing the changes back to your remote repository. All those things I'm going to explain with an example. So as you're aware, like in order to do these operations, you should have a valid GitHub account. So kindly log into github.com and create your repository. So I'm going to do the same thing. Kindly look at my screen where I go to my GitHub. I logged in with my credentials, and this is the screen that I see by default. And now you have multiple options to create the repositories. You can either create from on the left hand side. If you don't see the left hand side menu, then you can come to your profile and then click on your repository. That is the second option in the menu, your profile and your repositories. So all you have to do is you have to click on your repositories. In your case, the repositories is going to be empty because you're new to GitHub. I have some other repositories. That doesn't make any much difference. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to click on new repository because I'm willing to create a new repository, and I'm going to name this repository name as Skill House Repo. It's the name that I'm giving, and description. My description, it's an optional field. You can still fill that Skill House Repo. And here you have two options, public and private. For now, you can name it as public, and you can choose public option and then create the repository. So what happens when you click on this create repository is your remote repository is going to get created. As you can see, https github.com Vinod Mangalore skillhouse repo.git. So what you have done is you have logged into GitHub and then created the remote repository. Since you are in the server github.com, the repository that you're going to create is called as remote repository because it does not exist yet in your system, in your local machine. It exists in the server. That's why we call it as remote repository. And once you create the remote repositories, there are multiple options which will help you to clone that in your local machine. So the next step is you're going to come to your machine and clone your repository. In my previous video, I have explained there are multiple options. Either you can clone your remote repository into your local repository with the help of Git command line interface, Git commands, or you can choose to uh, have a user interface such as Visual Studio in order to clone your repository. To make our job easier, I'm not going to get into the command line interface because you will have to remember the commands. So instead, I'm going to go with an approach of Visual Studio. So what I do is I open up my Visual Studio, click on open. This is a new instance of Visual Studio. So the step that we are planning to do is that clone your repository in local, right? Because you are logged into GitHub, this step is over. You have created your repository. The repository name is Skill House Repo, and your repository is successfully created in the GitHub. Now, all you have to do is that clone your repository in the local. So I'm choosing an approach of Visual Studio. So I am opening the Visual Studio 2022 and I click on clone a repository. Now this asks for the remote repository location, and also where you want to map the remote location. See, this concept is when you clone your repository, it is going to be cloned into your local path, and you have an option to choose which path you want to select, right? Say, if in my case, what I do is that I open the my local drive, and I create a new folder named as work, because this is where I want to clone a repository called skillhouse repo. And I'm going to copy this and go to my Visual Studio, and local path I'm going to select it as work. Now coming to the remote repository location from which we have to copy the repository from, right? So you have to paste that remote repository URL here. So in order to do that, you should know the URL. So let's go to your GitHub. You have the URL, right? https github.com. In my case, it is Vinod Bangalore /GitHouse repo. So kindly copy this. So you can either copy like this, Control C, or you can click on this option, which will copy, and paste it over here. So what you have is you have your remote repository URL. You have the local path that is in the C drive under Vinod folder. I have a folder named work. So I'm mapping my remote repository to the local folder. So this is the remote repository, and this is the path where the local repository has to be created. So now I click on clone. As you can see, it clones the skillhouse repo, right? And all you see is that the main branch, I am going to explain you the branch concept later on, but you can see there is a local repository created with the name called work. I have other local repositories, but let's not worry about them. Only concentrate on work folder, work repository. This is my local repository. So the concept, as usual, this is the remote repository you have successfully cloned to your local repository, and your local repository is created. You may be wondering, what is this repository? Repository is a storage where every change in that storage is tracked, right? So it's not simply a folder or simply a source. It's a data source, or it's a storage where even if you add a simple file, it will be tracked, and it will prompt you, do you want to make such changes to the repository? So now in the local repository that is successfully created, you see that this is my local repository. Earlier nothing was there. Now when I clone it, it opens it. It created the .git folder. That means the repository has been created. Now if you can go to this config path, and if you want to open that in the notepad, you'll be able to see what is the URL, the remote URL with which this repository, local repository, is created with. You don't have to do that necessarily, but now all you know is that in the work folder, your local repository has been created. Now what I'm going to do is simply look at this. I'm going to create a new text document in this local repository. In this local repository, that is nothing but C drive /work, I'm going to create a simple file. So say new file sample.txt, and then say hi, Control save, Control S, and now come back to your Visual Studio, where the repository you have cloned. With the help of this Visual Studio, you have cloned the repository too, and you'll be able to see this change sample text. Now you can see this VS is something which you can ignore. You don't want to check in that, but sample text is something that you want to commit. So just because I created a file here in the sample text, see, all of you please understand that both are referring to the same folder. This is, I'm opening it with the help of Visual Studio. Here it is directly in the folder. So all you have done is that I created a sample text, and then now it has been tracked. It has notified that sample text is a change. Now you have a sample text which is added to the local repository, right? But it is not yet part of your local repository because you have not yet committed that change to the local repository. So you need to do a commit. I am committing the sample text. This is a friendly comment that you need to write to my local repo, and then you click on commit all. The commit has been created successfully, but this commit is only limited to your local repository because the file you added to that path and you committed. So that means that your local repository is now updated with the sample.txt or the file that you have recently created. Now your job is to push that change to the repository. Before that, I just want to help you guys to understand one thing. It is not just the sample text, or if you add anything in this folder, even if I add simply drag and drop a picture, right? It is going to create that. It is going to track that. If I am simply dragging and dropping a picture, it will track that change. So when I say any file, it also includes a project file or a solution file which is created via Visual Studio. So usually we use Git in order to track our source code files. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new console application in this path. Okay, so that is the next step that I'm planning to do. I have created a repository and I added a sample text which has been tracked, and then I showed you how to commit that. But this time I'm going to create a console application in my local repository. So how do I create the console application? You create the console application with the help of Visual Studio, right? How did you create the sample text file? With the help of Notepad. Similarly, you create a Visual Studio, you create the console application with the help of Visual Studio. So you open the Visual Studio and create a new project, which is a console application, because that's what I want to do that. And console application is C#. I say next. I name this as console app. Location, I want to keep this project in the location called work, correct? That's what I want to do. I said work, and solution is going to be new solution, and this is the work location where my repository, local repository exists. It is going to track every change that I do, right? So I click on next, .NET support, okay, create, and it is going to create your console application in the local path. As you can see, along with sample text which I've added previously, I can also see the console application. Now if you come to the previous Visual Studio, you can see those changes. It is not, you can ignore this .vs. It is not just the previously committed that has got sample.txt. Now I have created a new console application, and it tracks that change, right? You can see that it is tracking that change. Now come here, this object is of no use for us, and it is dynamically created, so you can ignore such things. Once you make your changes to your local repository, that is work, and console application is already there. Now, one thing that you will observe is you don't see the file named as sample text right now, because Earlier it was there, now you only see console application. That's because you have already committed the sample.txt earlier to this repository. So since you have committed the sample.txt file to this repository that is called a local repository, it won't be tracking it again unless there is a change, right? Because there is no change. Now it is already committed and it is not a new file, but console application is a new file. That's the reason why you see the console application folder. But now if I edit this hi there and I change this to sample text, then it will track. You can look at this, sample text has come now. So since there was a change in the sample text, that's the reason why it's coming. And console application, you don't need this object and other things, so you can simply ignore them by ignoring these local items, because that obj folder usually contains the output or the compiled code, which we don't need to track, right? Which we can always go ahead and then create it in our local, but we don't need to track that in the Git. So all we need to track is the project file and the codes, source codes. So what I do here is I click on these two items which I need to commit to my local repository. Please understand that so far we have not yet committed these changes to the remote repository. All we are doing is we are adding the files to the local repository, and in the local repository we are pushing our changes or committing our changes. So I stage these changes, and I'm going to say the staged changes I'm going to commit. So all you have to do is that right click the changes, stage the changes that you want to commit, and say I am committing your own comment. You don't have to copy my own the same comment. New project named console app. Commit the staged. This is committed successfully to the local folder, right? If you look at this, now this is no more a new file. This is a part of this local repository, right? Now once the local repository is updated, what you need to do is you need to make the same changes to your remote repository, right? So what I'll do is I will open the GitHub. Sorry for that. So I committed, right? This command only commits to the local repository. This is using a git commit, git command line. So since I'm following a different approach with the Visual Studio, you don't get to execute these commands. So the local repository is updated with what? It is updated with Visual Studio, the console application as well as a sample text. Now my job is to update my remote repository with the local repository. So for that I need to do a push. Till then you can see your remote repository is not yet having these changes. Say for example, in my local repository I have these changes, yeah, because if I go here I have already committed multiple things now. But if you go to your remote repository, you will observe that it is not yet available. Nothing is there yet. It is not yet having any Visual Studio file or the console application or the sample text. Only the local repository is updated with your changes. Now we need to push that to the local remote repository. We have two options. Either we have to execute the command line git push, which we don't want to follow. We are following the Visual Studio approach. So let's go to the Visual Studio, and you got to push the changes to your remote repository. So once you push the changes, all the changes that is part of your local repository will also be synced up with your remote repository. Now if you come, you will see your sample text, your console app, console project, console CLN, and then project program.cs, etc. Everything is part of your remote repository as well, right? And this is what we call it as syncing your local repository with the remote repository. So this is how usually the changes works. Now all of you can observe that your remote repository is in sync with your local repository. Yes. So now what happens if I add a new file in the local repository? So come to your local repository. Where is the local repository? It's in the work folder. I create a new file called sample new, and then I say hi. Now you will see that change in the Visual Studio, which you have opened, which you have used to clone the repository. You'll see that sample new text is tracked. Do you want to stage this VS change? No. But do you want to stage this and commit this sample new text? Yes. So first I stage this for the commit, and then say I committed a new file named sample new.txt. Commit the stage. Now what is updated? Your local repository is updated. But does that file exist in your remote repository yet? Let's go ahead and look. Let's click on this code. It is not there yet. So your local repository is not in sync with the remote repository. In order to do that, what we need to do, we have to push that change. So come to your Visual Studio back again and push the changes back to your remote repository. Now you refresh the screen, you will see the new file. This is how you commit and push. So there is a difference between commit and push. Git commit is to commit the changes to your local repository. Git push is to push the changes which are committed to your local repository to the remote repository. This is how your GitHub or the Git commit and push works. Thank you. Hope this video is helpful.